Extreme cold is something that I have actively avoided ever since I moved away from my home state of Michigan. But now that I'm back up north in the Hoosier state of Indiana, a major part of my life has been adapting to the frigid winter weather. And friends, I still hate being cold. I'd rather be sweating in the sun on any given day of the year. Where do you land on this whole thing?
Cold, easy. I sweat so easily.
Absolutely hot. I just love the heat. My body loves the heat.
If I died cold, I could be preserved later.
Cold, you gotta do too much covering up. It takes too much energy.
I'd pick a hot climate over a cold climate because I associate a hot climate with longer days. When it's cold, I end up spending more time inside, which makes me sad.
I think it brings out some tensions in people. You're all cooped up, and so you don't really socialize quite as much. You're staying inside. It can kind of make people a little bit more agitated and less social.
Oof. That reminds me of the lockdowns during the peak of the pandemic. Sheltering in one place for a long period of time can be rough. But the fact of the matter is, climate change is making us face more extreme weather, both hot and cold. We're seeing more tornadoes, more flooding, more snow. And I don't know about you, but I go inside when the temperatures start to drop. I have no idea how people live in places like Yakutsk, Russia, where the temperature can get as low as negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I honestly do not think I could live there. What's your solution to surviving the cold?
Always have a warm blanket on hand.
Just like make tea or hot chocolate or something. Bundle up because it gets cold in my apartment still too.
Get some good socks and good leggings and good sweatpants and good ski pants and then a good tank top and a good other shirt and another shirt and a ski jacket and a hat and a scarf.
I paint. That makes me happy, makes me forget that it's so nasty outside.
I have always been told there's no bad weather, there's just bad gear. You need your hands covered and your head covered.
Okay, so warm blanket, nice gear, and heat. Got it. But what about when it comes to inside our bodies, at the molecular level? Are there genetic reasons some of us are predispositioned to prefer hot or cold climates? From the Stowers Institute for Medical Research and KCUR studios in Kansas City, this is Seeking a Scientist, a podcast where science fiction meets reality. I'm Dr. Kate Bieberdorf, aka Kate the Chemist, and in this episode, we're exploring the science of the extreme cold. How do our bodies adapt to frigid climates? And what can we learn from communities that have a long history of living and working in the cold?
You okay, OB?
I'm fine. I just need to get warm.
Do bundle up. It's awfully cold outside.
To answer all this, I talked to a new colleague of mine, Cara Ocobock, a professor of anthropology at the University of Notre Dame, and no surprise, she likes it cold.
My bedroom here is kept at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, I jumped in the freezing cold lake the other day twice. I am just built for that.
Appropriately, her work focuses on people facing very cold situations and how they've adapted to survive in them. And when I talked to her, she was in Inari, Finland, which is more than 150 miles north of the Arctic Circle.
Once you get this far north, it's so peacefully quiet. And then when it's nighttime, it is dark, like dark, dark. The serenity surprised me. The northern lights are just the most insane thing ever. I can't imagine what prehistoric people thought they were. Seeing that in the sky, it is beautiful, it is terrifying, it is everything.
Okay, it sounds like you really like that environment. Have you always been passionate about researching cold climates specifically?
That is not where things began. So when I applied to graduate school, I always love this, I applied to work on orangutan biomechanics.
Then in grad school, Cara read a paper that looked into the maximum number of calories a mammal could expend in any given situation. And what it found was so peculiar that she said sayonara to orangutans and greeted the extreme cold as her new life's work. For this study, they placed mice in different extreme conditions to see how they'd handle it. They'd watch them run continuously on a wheel, lactate for hours on end, and basically just survive in the extreme cold. And then they took it up a notch by combining these conditions in various ways, all in order to figure out how much energy the mice could put into reacting to these intense conditions. Cara was transfixed. This was the moment when it really hit her. She had to know the answer to the question, how extreme could we go?
And I was just like, I know I can't do exactly that in humans, but how could I approach figuring out the way humans deal with extreme conditions and how does their metabolism respond in those extreme conditions?
To find the answer, she worked with the National Outdoor Leadership School out in the Rocky Mountains, where she collected data from students who lived outside in tents for months at a time.
So I was able to not only deal with the extremely high levels of physical activity, but also I was able to cover them in spring, summer, fall, and winter. So I could incorporate the extreme environment as well as the extreme physical activity. And so that's kind of where the extreme bit kind of all fell into place for me.
What do you think you learned most on that experience? Was it just how to be there in the cold and participate in these studies, or was it actually the science and collecting the data?
There was a bit of both. I realized I'm so much more capable of crazy hiking and physical things I had never done before. My family is not an outdoorsy family. We never went camping. And then all of a sudden I'm, at 15,000 feet in the bear's ears, hiking all of my crap out on my back, plus research equipment. It was badass. And I felt badass coming out of that. And then as for the science side, the cool thing that came out of this, that had not been shown in a kind of natural setting before, but had been shown in a lab, is how important it is to stay physically active in the cold, because our bodies are physiologically limited in how much heat we can produce. And luckily, our muscles are pretty darn inefficient. And so every time we move, we lose a good amount of energy just to heat loss. But that heat loss is really helpful in a cold environment.
Depending on who you talk to, you're going to hear a different definition for cold. Some scientists will categorize it as anything below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas others will say temps below 23 degrees Fahrenheit. If those numbers sound weirdly specific, it's because they are converted from Celsius. Others define cold as any temperature low enough to cause a human being to experience discomfort.
Where is everybody?
Well, it's cold, Margie.
But today, we're going to investigate the cold within a city in Finland where their coldest day on record was negative 56 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's talk about Finland. Tell me why you targeted this specific population and what was the process like to gain their trust?
In Finno-Scandinavia, so Norway, Sweden, Finland, and parts of Russia, which is not Finno-Scandinavia, you have reindeer herders. You have the indigenous Sami population, as well as non-native individuals who also take part in reindeer herding.
Since reindeer herders are exposed to the extreme cold and do a lot of physically active work outside, Cara thought they would be the perfect candidates for her research, if she could convince them to work with her.
Finland is a place, and especially in further north, where there is a history of research abuse. A lot of the older folks here remember people coming to their classrooms when they were children and making them put their hands in buckets of ice water and holding it there as long as they could. So, there's a history of this. And so that's something I had to work with as well, and in making sure, right, we want to do this. There will be a benefit to you. I'm not going to just force you to be cold. You have agency in all of this, and you are in control of the situation. And also, we're going to give you lots of health data in return in hopes that it benefits you.
Cara needed to provide an incentive, a reason for the reindeer herders to want to participate in her research. So her promise was that for every person she studied, she would collect total cholesterol panels, glucose panels, and white blood cell counts, and then send the results to each participant.
And so, to use the worst pun ever, I cold emailed researchers in Norway, Sweden, and Finland with this idea of, hey, I want to study cold climate adaptations and metabolic changes in, reindeer herders specifically. There were a couple of folks here, Drs. Minna Turunen and Päivi Sopala, who were really interested in this idea. I spent 2 years going back and forth to Finland establishing this field site before a single point of data was actually collected. So it takes a long time to establish the connections and to build the trust to actually do good quality field work.
On these trips, she was able to observe and interact with the Sami people. and get up close and personal with their reindeer.
It's fascinating to watch. Like, I've watched a roundup before, and it's pretty impressive, actually. It's a lot more like physical work. Like, they are wrestling with reindeer by the antlers to move them from place to place.
Even though Red-Nosed Rudolph is often portrayed as small and adorable, real reindeer are huge and can be quite intimidating up close. The biggest males are about 550 pounds and can be over 4 feet tall. For that reason, humans have hunted reindeer, also called caribou in North America, for thousands of years. We can use their fur, meat, milk, and antlers for numerous purposes. But since reindeer spend about 40% of their lives in the snow, they aren't the easiest mammals for us to access. And due to their unique environments, only a few demographics are genetically equipped to withstand these intensely cold temperatures. But why is that? Well, one newer theory has to do with brown adipose tissue. Brown fat, as it's sometimes called, typically pops up in conversations about the extreme cold.
Brown adipose tissue is a kind of fat that burns only to keep you warm. For those of you who do not know what Fat Bear Week is, it is the greatest thing ever, where one of the Alaska national parks, they take pictures of their bears when they come out of hibernation in the spring, when they're all skinny and sad. And they take pictures again in the fall when they have put on a ton of fat right before hibernation.
I am short, fat, and proud of that.
And you get to vote on your favorite fat bear.
How successful were bears this year in their efforts to get fat? That's a question we'll investigate as we reveal the contenders and bracket for the 2024 Fat Bear Week competition.
A lot of the fat those bears put on is brown fat, brown adipose tissue. And those bears, when they hibernate, rely on that brown adipose tissue to maintain their body temperature while they're hibernating. And so in humans, we've known about brown fat in babies for a really, really long time. Babies are born with like almost a vest/cape of brown fat.
What is it? Some kind of cloak?
Where they have it kind of down the chest and then down the back and over the kidneys, kind of over the major organs. And that's because babies don't have a developed thermoregulatory system. They can't maintain their body temperature, and they also can't put a coat on when they're cold.
Brown fat makes up about 5% of a baby's overall body weight, and it's believed to provide an extra layer of cushioning for their organs, in addition to helping babies regulate their body temperature.
And they burn through that brown fat pretty quickly until their thermoregulatory system matures. It was thought that once babies burned through that fat, that we adults didn't have it. That we burned through it, it was, one and done. Turns out we have it. And it turns out likely everybody has some to some degree. And in adults, it is located along the major deep blood vessels, so your aorta and your, inferior and superior vena cava. But it's also located kind of what we call the supraclavicular area, which is that triangle space between your neck and your shoulder. And so it's only been in the past 20, 25 years that brown adipose tissue has been, quote unquote, rediscovered in adult humans.
Okay, but wait, why do we refer to it as brown fat?
Brown fat is called brown because it's got tons of mitochondria. And I'm almost guarantee everybody at home listening to this is like the powerhouse of the cell. Yes, that Pavlovian response is correct. Brown fat is packed with mitochondria. It's got lots and lots, which gives it that brown color. And the process typically in your body, the mitochondria produce energy, hence the powerhouse of the cell. Well, in brown fat, that process is short-circuited. So instead of producing energy in the form of ATP, it produces heat by releasing protons.
ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is commonly referred to as the energy currency of the cell. And you can kind of think of it like a bank. When you eat something, the energy extracted from the food is stored in the form of ATP. And this is important because if you need to quickly run for a bus or hop up a few flights of stairs, your body can withdraw that saved ATP to pay for the energy to perform your desired action. But what Cara shared with me is freaking fascinating. We don't use ATP when attempting to warm our bodies. Instead, there's a thermal regulatory mechanism that is completely dependent on brown fat.
So my population here in Finland, I have measured their brown adipose tissue, and we're also able to measure what sort of fuel they're burning when we cold expose them. And so that's, your proteins, your fats, and your carbs. And the population here seems to use more fats. And when I say use, this is not conscious. This is what their body is doing on its own. It's not a decision of burn fat now that the person decides. But a population in Siberia, their brown fat seems to burn more carbs, glucose.
If I may, allow me to throw a little chemistry into this conversation. When we burn 1 gram of fat, we can extract 37 kilojoules of energy. But when we burn 1 gram of protein or 1 gram of carbohydrates, aka glucose, we can only extract 17 kilojoules of energy. So based on Cara's research, it appears that evolution has helped certain populations determine which fuel source is the best for their bodies to burn in order to survive in their cold environments. Remember, we need fat on our bodies for insulation. So even though we can pull more energy out of 1 gram of fat versus a gram of protein or a gram of carbs, it may not be in our body's best interest to solely use fat as a fuel source. Then again, it's not as simple as cold climate equals burning fat.
My former graduate student, who's now a postdoc, she worked in Samoa, which is a tropical island. You would not expect a warming tissue, a quote unquote cold climate tissue, to be in Samoa, but guess what it is? And their brown adipose tissue seems to like a mixed fuel between fat and glucose. So every time we think we understand something about brown fat, we collect more data and realize we know nothing, which is wonderful because that means we just get to do a whole lot more science. So I'm good with this.
Here's what we know so far. Brown fat is activated in colder temperatures, and it's used to help us maintain our overall body temperature. Essentially, right before our bodies begin to shiver, the brown fat can help us burn different combinations of glucose and fat, and that releases heat in a process called thermogenesis. For my friends with a strong thermodynamics background, the major difference is that brown fat is used to convert chemical energy into heat, whereas ATP helps us convert chemical energy into work. In short, brown fat keeps us warm, and ATP helps us perform daily activities. And while Cara was learning all of this, she discovered something that was scientifically unprecedented. The female reindeer herders had a higher resting metabolic rate than the male reindeer herders. You may recall from your Bio 101 class that your resting metabolic rate is defined as the amount of calories you burn when your body is 100% still.
So resting metabolic rate is very, very strongly correlated and predicted by your age, sex, and weight. And by weight in particular, we're talking about fat-free mass. So anything except body fat is what scales really, really well with your resting metabolic rate. Males on average are larger than females, which means on average they have higher resting metabolic rates than females. But the females here, who tend to be 20 to 30 kilograms lighter than the males, so they're not as big as the males, had higher resting metabolic rates. And that has never been seen. It has just never been seen before.
Whoa. So what could that mean?
So a couple of things that I think are going on. And it's a combination of climate change is a big part of it, but also how every system in the body is connected. And if you tweak one thing, you're going to end up tweaking a whole lot of other things because, again, they're all interconnected. And so females typically have one big extra physiological demand that males don't, and that's reproduction. And that is, if you choose to have children, that's an inescapable metabolic demand. And there is a hormone that is important for both reproduction as well as setting the thermostat for your resting metabolic rate. And that's thyroid hormones.
Now, I'll admit that some scientists will fight me on this next statement, but in general, women typically have higher thyroid-stimulating hormone concentrations than men. And we know that thyroid hormones are responsible for activating genes that increase our metabolic rates. When that happens, we use more oxygen and consume more fuel to kickstart thermogenesis, aka we generate more heat to stay warm. So it's possible that thyroid hormones are keeping women's resting metabolic rates right on on track, but the men are exhibiting the unprecedented lower resting metabolic rates for a completely different reason.
So Finland has experienced the effects of climate change sooner and more acutely than other parts of the world. This is true for Scandinavia. You are seeing warmer temperatures. You are seeing later snowfall, earlier snow melt, more rain on snow events, all of these different things. When I was here in February 2023, which should be the coldest month of the year, like I said, 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, it hit 43 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is a place that should be like negative 20 at this time. I went outside without a coat. It was frightening.
With climate change, there's less pressure to maintain a higher metabolic rate, therefore less pressure to maintain a higher level of thyroid hormone.
Cold is not as cold as it used to be, both because of the climate, but also improved technology. Everyone's got indoor heating of some sort. They've all got great clothes and car warmers and things like that. So they're just not quite as cold exposed as they would have been 150, 200 years ago.
Over time, we may see that this could cause an adverse effect on women, especially on their typical reproductive physiology. But for men, with their lower thyroid hormone concentrations, we're already observing these changes. Do you ever have any pushback, considering that climate change is making the planet warmer? Do you have any pushback for studying the cold instead of spending your time on studying the heat?
I haven't at this point. But there are two things there, that there's a lot of people studying hot climate populations. They don't need another person there. And two, cold is still likely going to be a stressor. And when we talk about climate change, it's not just about overall global warming, which is absolutely true, but we're also getting highly variable weather going on and very extreme weather conditions that we haven't seen before. We'll see extreme cold snaps in places that have never seen it before. So trying to understand exactly how humans deal with cold is one important aspect.
And friends, how Cara is attempting to tackle this issue is next level.
I have bomb suits in my lab, Kate.
If you didn't catch that, she said she has bomb suits. We've talked about how Cara Ocobock is studying the impact of cold climates on our bodies and health. But you may be wondering, how exactly is she studying it? One method she uses is thermal imaging.
So they're infrared cameras. And so if you imagine, any movie in which you see these rainbow colors of, an image of a person, it's a heat map of a person, basically.
And using these infrared cameras, Cara and her team take thermal images of her participants before and during cold exposure. And they take images of two key areas. First, the area between the neck and the shoulder, called the supraclavicular region, a spot where we know there is brown fat, and then the sternum, an area where we know there is no brown fat. Before cold exposure, both areas are usually somewhere around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or whatever your body's natural internal temperature is. But once cold exposure starts, that's when things get interesting.
What we often see is that area at the neck where there is brown fat, the temperature does one of three things. Either goes up, even though they're cold exposed, the temperature gets higher, stays the same despite being cold exposed, or only reduces a little. Whereas the sternum drops dramatically. You see much colder temperatures at the sternum during cold exposure. And so you always see this massive difference in temperature change between that brown fat area and the non-brown fat area.
So the areas on our body that have brown fat can tolerate the cold and stay warm much more easily than the areas that have no brown fat. Did you design the cold suit?
This is the best part. It's the inner lining of a military bomb suit.
Y'all, if you don't know, a bomb suit is this big, crazy piece of armor that protects you from the pressure generated from a bomb. But Cara's participants only wear the inner layer of it.
It is used to keep people who defuse bombs cold when they're in extreme hot climate, when they're in that crazy mechanized protective suit defusing a bomb. I have bomb suits in my lab, Kate.
How long are they in the suit for?
So technically they're in the suit for 90 minutes, but only 30 of those minutes are they cold exposed. Once they are resting, we don't want them to move again. So we get them in the suit, have them lay down for 30 minutes. And then we measure their resting metabolic rate at room temperature for 30 minutes. And then we flood the suit with water and measure that for 30 minutes.
And they're still laying down the whole time?
They're still laying down, doing nothing. We wander around them, taking thermal images and checking blood pressure and checking, internal temperature, all of those things. The only rule is they can't sleep. And that's really hard for some people. Oh, I have had to poke a few people awake before in my times. I always feel so bad.
Yeah, as a professor that loves teaching 8 a.m. classes, I can relate to that feeling. What I think is particularly neat about Cara and her peers' research is that over time, they've started to notice patterns, how certain body types appear to be better suited for colder weather.
Short and squat is best. This is the best way to say it. The closer in shape you are to a sphere, the better you do in cold. Whereas the closer in shape you are to a column, the better you do in heat. And it's all about the relationship of your body mass to your surface area. So a sphere maximizes volume or body mass. So that maximizes your metabolic rate while minimizing the exposure, the exposed surface or your skin to the cold environment. Whereas a column, you have minimized your body weight and maximized your surface area. So you're able to dump heat to the environment, whereas the sphere is able to conserve heat.
This is referred to as Bergmann's rule. Larger bodies are better for cold climates. There's also Allen's rule. You want shorter appendages if you're going to explore the extreme cold.
And the most wonderful example of this is, deeply ancient, which would be Neanderthals.
Neanderthals are often depicted as brutish cavemen, but science shows that our early ancestors were actually quite advanced.
They were what we consider a hyperpolar morphology. They were short and stout. They had wide pelvis, males as well. Everyone thinks of, it's only the females that have a wide pelvis for birthing hips and all of that. Neanderthal males had wider pelvis than females today have. So they were broad and they were short and they had very short limbs relative to us, for example. And this was especially true for their forearms and their shins. They're like the linebackers of human evolution. It's Notre Dame. We have to make a football reference. I think we're contractually obligated.
I think that's fair. It was in my contract. Yeah, you were right. Neanderthals were truly shaped like linebackers. They were loaded with muscle and had lots of brown fat. We believe their short and stout bodies were extremely efficient at regulating their body temperatures.
One of the other interesting things that has come out of this work is this a potential connection between cold climate adaptations and what's known as metabolically healthy obesity. And metabolically healthy obesity are folks who, by BMI standards, and I hate BMI, and we could have a whole podcast on why BMI is garbage.
Agreed. Body mass index, aka BMI, is calculated by taking your weight and dividing it by your height squared. This number does not factor in your muscle mass or your body fat percentage, and it most certainly does not distinguish between the different types of fat on your body. It's a terrible way to evaluate health.
But even folks who have high body fat percentage, so people who are obese even by body fat standards, but do not seem to suffer any negative health consequences we typically associate with having obesity. Cholesterol profiles are all normal. Glucose profiles are normal. Blood pressure is normal, all of that. And we have seen some hints of that here in that 75% of our population is overweight or obese or have obesity. And with a few exceptions, the vast majority are very healthy. Like the cholesterol looks good, amazing HDL cholesterol, glucose profiles look good. And we've been hypothesizing that cold climate adaptations might be a big part of this. And it's that, fat is the most important fuel to use in a cold climate that might help them handle higher fat and deal with cholesterol levels.
This data supports Bergmann's rule. Bigger bodies, the ones with more fat or those with tons of muscle, do better in extreme cold. And this is likely why leaner bodies typically have the most brown fat. It's nature's way of keeping our skinny friends nice and toasty. In my opinion, Bergmann's and Allen's rules seem fairly intuitive, but this third rule, Thompson's rule, completely caught me off guard. Before I give it away, do you have a guess at what other body characteristic is typically associated with cold climate populations?
I'm waiting!
long, narrow noses. They are better at processing the cold air before it hits and startles our lungs.
Yeah, so it's more about what's going on the inside of that nose than what you rarely see on the outside. You have these, think of them almost like partial snail shells. This is going to sound so weird. You have these things called your internal, your nasal turbinates. And they're like these curly Q snail shell things. You've got 3 sets on either side. Or I should say 3 sets, 1 set on either side in your nose. And they basically create these spaces for air to like whip around on the inside of your nose. So they're also covered in like this mucous membrane lining. So in a cold environment, that becomes really important to both humidify and warm up the air before it gets down into your lungs, because cold, dry air can cause damage to the very delicate tissues of your lungs.
Remember how I mentioned a few episodes ago that my nose sweats when I get stressed? Yeah, my people are from the north, and our long, narrow noses are trying to help protect our lungs.
And so those really tall, big noses, and we'll go back to Neanderthals, they had honking schnozzes, man, huge noses. That was really important for maintaining warm, humid air before it gets down into the lungs. It has also been hypothesized and really only tested with computer simulation that it would have been important for the very high metabolic rates of Neanderthals. So to link everything back to metabolic rates, is that having a larger nasal cavity would allow greater oxygen intake with each breath.
And more oxygen means more thermogenesis. So a better chance of not freezing to death when exposed to cold weather. So I'm curious about humans that are exposed to cold for a very short burst of time versus living in the cold. So if our body just does like a quick thing, we run outside and then we come back inside versus living there, when does this brown fat show up?
The brown fat should pop up immediately, honestly. That once your body is acutely and even just mildly, like we've seen people's brown fat pop up, like activate at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not that cold. So just acute mild cold exposure is all you need to activate the brown adipose tissue. This is why people say like sleep with your window open because, or sleep naked, get rid of an extra blanket, whatever. You increase that cold exposure just a tiny bit and your brown fat could be activating. But acute cold exposure, you typically see 3 big things going on. 1, brown fat. 2, shivering. We've all experienced shivering. And 3, you're likely going to get stuff going on with your blood vessels, typically called vasoconstriction.
This happens whenever our body gets too cold and our blood vessels constrict to limit the blood flow to our hands and feet. If your hands are always freezing, like mine, you likely have some vasoconstriction going on. But then, when your skin gets too cold, your body briefly lets warm blood re-enter your nose, fingers, and toes, and this is called vasodilation. Our bodies usually cycle between vasoconstriction and vasodilation to maintain the perfect balance. We want our fingers to be just warm enough to avoid amputation, and for our core temperature to be warm enough to prevent hypothermia and massive organ failure. But what Cara learned is that cold climate populations are especially good at cycling between vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which allows for them to withstand colder temps for longer periods of time.
That will happen in other folks as well, but it's just nowhere near as a nice, smooth oscillation or as efficient as you see in people who are regularly cold exposed.
But thanks to evolution, our bodies can get better at handling the freezing cold temperatures.
Don't be so afraid of it. Actually do expose yourself to cold, build yourself up as you go along. I'm not saying go and spend 10 hours outside without clothes on in the dead of winter in the Arctic, but don't completely avoid it. It's only going to make things worse for you.
Y'all, this would be the perfect time to play the theme song from Frozen. But honestly, we've all heard it so many times, I'll spare you. Instead, let's skip right into the rapid fire questions. Name a country or a state that you would like to backpack in.
Ooh, I would love to go to the Black Forest of Germany and have somebody help me identify mushrooms that I can actually eat and not die.
Would you rather fight a polar bear or a grizzly bear?
Grizzly bear? Do I have to give a why?
I don't know. You don't have to. You can if you want to.
I'm going with, I've seen grizzly bears scratch their backs on trees and that just is funny, so that's why I chose them.
snowboarding, skiing, or sledding?
Skiing, but with short skis. I like short skis.
Last one. On a scale of 1 to 10, how accurate is Disney's movie Frozen?
2?
I'm surprised you gave it anything. I don't think it's scientifically accurate.
I mean, water freezes. There is land and sky and people. Reindeer do exist.
Okay, friends, this is where we say goodbye to Cara as she heads off to summit a mountain in a t-shirt or jump in a hole in a frozen lake. Meanwhile, the rest of us will bundle up and cook lots of warm food to get through these final winter months. And next time you're feeling a bit chilly, maybe give thanks to your brown fat, working hard to keep you warm, or your blood vessels for how they're constricting and dilating to save you from hypothermia. The extreme cold is serious business, but at least for me, talking with Cara and hearing about the ways that reindeer herders' bodies adapt to the cold, it left me with a sense of awe. There's so much to learn from communities who are already living in the extremes, but it takes tenacious scientists like Cara who can earn their trust and get her hands on a few military bomb suits before we can advance the research and benefit from the beauty of evolution. Although if you do decide to take on the extreme cold, remember, there's no bad weather, just bad gear. You've got this. Thank you so much for listening to Seeking a Scientist, and special thanks to everyone who has been writing reviews and sharing this podcast with their friends. It really does help us celebrate badass scientists like Cara and get them that standing ovation they so deserve. Seeking a Scientist is a production of KCUR Studios in Kansas City, made possible with support from the Stowers Institute for Medical Research, where scientists work to accelerate our understanding of human health and disease. It's hosted by me, Dr. Kate Bieberdorf, aka Kate the Chemist. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Kate the Chemist, or the pod at Seeking a Sci Pod. This episode was produced by Olivia Hewitt and Suzanne Hogan. Our editor is Mackenzie Martin. Our digital editor is Gabe Rosenberg, mixed by Olivia Hewitt. Special thanks as always to the team at KCUR Studios, Byron Love, and Genevieve DesMarteau. You heard clips this episode from Home Alone 2, The Hateful Eight, Winnie the Pooh, Fargo, The Princess Bride, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Neanderthals 101 by National Geographic, freesound.org, and YouTube channels Animal Friends, Explore Bears and Bison, Paradox Mirror, and Free Audio Zone. Our original theme music is by The Coma Calling, and you heard additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay nerdy, my friends.